I bought that land 30 years ago, long before anyone thought to turn the valley into a retirement paradise. Back then it was nothing more than a forgotten stretch of fertile soil nestled between two forested ridges, with a river curling lazily through the center like a silver thread glinting in the sunlight. The property stretched for hundreds of acres, a place where I could breathe, build, and live without hearing a neighbor's leaf blower at 6 in the morning. I built my cabin by hand, stone by stone, log by log, sweating through humid summers and freezing through bitter winters. I didn't do it for anyone's approval. I did it because I wanted a place that was mine, where my family and I could sit on the porch and watch storms roll across the hills, where I could fish trout out of the river before breakfast, and where the only law that mattered was the one I lived by. The first time I heard the word HOA connected to my valley, I laughed. A homeowners association had no business out here in what most folks would call the middle of nowhere. This wasn't a subdivision with picket fences and perfectly trimmed lawns. This was wild country, stubborn and beautiful. But things started to change about 10 years ago, after the county built that new highway on the far side of the ridge. Suddenly, what was once a 2-hour drive from town became a quick 30-minute cruise. Investors started sniffing around. Surveyors showed up on the roadside, squinting through tripods and scribbling notes. I didn't think much of it until the day a man in a suit drove up my gravel road and introduced himself as a representative for a development group. He told me they were planning to build a series of homes on the east side of the river, a planned community with shared amenities that would increase local property values. He smiled while he said it, as if that was supposed to be good news. I told him plainly that they could build whatever they wanted as long as they stayed off my land. He nodded politely, handed me a business card, and left without an argument. For a while, I believed that was the end of it, but it wasn't. The next year, construction equipment started moving in. Bulldozers cleared trees I had walked past for decades, tearing through the soil like it was paper. I stood at the edge of my property line and watched them carve roads into the hillsides. At first, it was still across the river, outside my boundary. Then, slowly, the roads crept closer, inch by inch, like an invading army. I called the county office. They told me everything was permitted and legal. I asked for the survey maps, and when I got them, I realized something was wrong. The development company's map didn't match the one I had from when I bought the land. They had redrawn the boundary line. My land, hundreds of acres of it, had been quietly rezoned and split on paper, as if I didn't exist. I hired a lawyer. We spent months filing appeals, submitting documents, fighting through the layers of bureaucracy that seemed designed to grind a man down. And while I fought, the construction crews worked faster. Every time I drove into town, I saw new foundations being poured, new frames going up. The first house was finished by the time my case even got in front of the judge. I tried to get an injunction, but it was denied. The HOA was forming even before the paint dried on the first front door. By the time I realized how deep this went, they had built 35 homes, all of them on land I had paid for with my own money, land that had been mine since before most of those people even moved to the state. I knocked on doors, tried to speak to the new residents, tried to tell them they were living on stolen property. Some of them were polite, confused even, but most just looked at me like I was some bitter old man who couldn't stand progress. The HOA board sent me a letter warning me not to trespass on their property. Imagine that, being told to stay off your own land. That's when I stopped trying to play nice. They had taken my valley, but they had forgotten about the dam. When I first bought the land, the river had a tendency to flood in spring. To protect the cabin, I built a small private dam upstream. Nothing fancy, just a reinforced earth and rock barrier with a steel sluice gate I could open or close to control the flow. It kept the water level stable through the summer and prevented the cabin from washing away when the rains came heavy. Over the years, I maintained it religiously, reinforcing it after every storm. No one outside of my family even knew it was there, hidden behind a grove of pines. And now, standing there one early morning with the sun just barely breaking over the hills, I realized that dam was my last bit of leverage. The homes they had built sat right in the floodplain, the same floodplain I had spent decades managing. They had paved over the natural drainage ditches, rerouted runoff, and built basements where there should never have been basements. All I had to do was open the gate and let the river return to the path it had always wanted to take. I didn't make the decision lightly. For weeks, I sat on my porch and thought about it. I thought about my father, who taught me that a man has to stand up for himself when no one else will. I thought about every letter, every notice, every arrogant meeting where some developer told me, progress is inevitable. I thought about the people who called the sheriff on me just for walking across my own field. I thought about what it meant to lose everything you worked for. Not in a storm, not in a fire, but by the slow grind of paperwork and signatures. And one morning, when the fog still clung to the valley floor and the world was silent, I took my truck and drove up to the dam. The drive up to the dam was one I'd made hundreds of times before, but that morning it felt different. The gravel crunched under my tires like gunfire, echoing through the silent forest. The air was thick with mist, cool and damp, clinging to my skin as though the valley itself was holding its breath. When I reached the clearing, I parked the truck and stepped out slowly, listening. The river was calm, barely more than a whisper over the rocks, its surface smooth as glass. It looked innocent, almost gentle, but I knew what kind of force it held back. Behind that dam was months of collected water, stored up through a wet spring, waiting. The dam itself stood like a dark sentinel across the river, a mound of stone and earth I had tended like a garden. Every crack, every patch, every bolt in the sluice gate had my fingerprints on it. I climbed the embankment and stood at the top, hands on my hips, staring down at the steel wheel that controlled the flow. My heart was pounding. I wasn't just thinking about what I was about to do. I was thinking about the faces of every smug HOA member who had smiled at me when they said the word trespassing. I thought about the judge who had barely looked up from his paperwork when he dismissed my injunction. I thought about the so-called community newsletter that called me a hostile local who was threatening public harmony. The wheel was stiff from disuse, but I gripped it and started to turn. At first, nothing happened, just the groan of old metal resisting me. Then it gave way, turning slowly, and I heard the deep, guttural sound of water shifting behind the gate. The river below trembled, then began to swell, foam churning as the flow quickened. I stood there and turned the wheel until it wouldn't turn anymore, until the gate was fully open. Then I stepped back and watched as the river transformed from a quiet trickle into a roaring, unstoppable current. The water surged down the valley, picking up speed as it went. I could almost see it in my mind, the way it would rush past the pines, sweep through the low-lying meadows, and spill into the development where those neat little homes sat with their white fences and flower beds. I knew exactly which ones would flood first. I had mapped every contour of this land, walked every dip and rise. Those houses were built too low, too close to the riverbank, their foundations unprotected. I didn't stay to watch the whole valley flood. Not yet. I climbed back into the truck and drove down the road, following the river as it swelled. The roar of the water grew louder with every bend. By the time I reached the edge of the development, the first houses were already taking on water. I parked on a rise overlooking the subdivision and stepped out. What I saw below made my stomach twist, not with guilt, but with something darker, satisfaction. The street that had once been dry and dusty was now a rushing stream. Water lapped the driveways, spilling into garages. People were coming out of their homes, still in pajamas, shouting to one another, pointing at the rising river. A couple of them tried to move their cars, but it was already too late. The water was up to the wheel wells. The HOA president, a man I'd only ever seen in a pressed polo shirt with clipboard in hand, was standing knee-deep, yelling into his phone, probably calling the county emergency line. I watched him for a long time, my arms crossed, the cold wind cutting across my face. I wasn't cheering, I wasn't smiling, but I wasn't sorry either. They had taken something from me, and this was me taking it back. Nature had always wanted to reclaim this floodplain. All I had done was stop holding it back. Of course, part of me knew this wasn't over. There would be consequences. There always are. The sheriff would come out, maybe even the state police. There would be lawsuits, accusations, maybe even charges. But standing there, watching the water climb higher and higher, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. For once, I wasn't powerless. For once, they were the ones scrambling to protect what was theirs. A few of the homeowners spotted me up on the rise. One of them pointed, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rush of water. Another one started running toward me, wading through the current until it got too deep to go any further. He was screaming now, his words carried away by the wind, but I knew what he was saying. He wanted me to stop it, but there was no stopping it now. The dam was open, and the river wasn't going to stop until it carved its way through every obstruction, every fence post, every manicured lawn that didn't belong here. I turned, got back into my truck, and drove home, leaving them to deal with what they had unleashed. Back at the cabin, I sat on the porch and listened. Even from miles away, I could hear the distant roar of the floodwaters. The ground seemed to tremble under my boots, as if the valley itself was waking up after a long sleep. I poured myself a cup of coffee, leaned back in my chair, and waited. By late afternoon, I heard sirens. Trucks from the fire department and the sheriff's office barreled down the main road, heading toward the development. Helicopters circled overhead, probably from the local news station. I imagined the footage they were getting. Aerial shots of a once pristine neighborhood now half submerged, with cars floating and fences toppling like matchsticks. The first official to come up my driveway was a deputy I knew from town. He stepped out of his cruiser slowly, like he was approaching a wild animal. He called out my name, asked if I was home. I stepped out onto the porch and nodded. He asked me if I knew anything about what had happened to the dam. I didn't lie. I opened it. I said, plain as day. He just stood there for a moment, staring at me like he wasn't sure if he'd heard me right. Then he asked why. Because they built on my land, I said. Because nobody listened when I told them this would happen. Because that valley was mine and they took it from me. The deputy didn't argue. He didn't threaten me. He just sighed, like a man who knew there was no simple way to fix what had been broken. He said there'd be an investigation, that I might be looking at charges for destruction of property or reckless endangerment. I told him he could do what he had to do. When he left, I sat back down, watching the sky turn red with the sunset. The water would eventually drain away, leaving behind mud, debris, and the wreckage of 35 homes that should never have been there in the first place. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, though I hadn't really slept much. The valley was eerily quiet, except for the faint gurgle of water still rushing through the newly carved channels. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of wet earth and pine, a smell I normally found comforting, but now was sharper, heavier, like the whole valley had been baptized overnight. The fog was thick, rolling in from the river in pale tendrils, and for a moment I couldn't even see the road that led down into the floodplain. I stood there with a mug of black coffee in my hand, listening to the distant hum of generators and pumps. Somewhere down there, the HOA members were still trying to salvage what they could. By mid-morning, the first news truck started showing up. They couldn't get far because the main road into the development was still underwater in places, so they parked near the ridge and sent reporters in on foot, wading through knee-high water to get their footage. I watched it all from my porch, the long camera lenses catching shots of the drowned streets and half-submerged mailboxes. It was strange to see my valley on television later that day when the news clips hit the local channels. They called it a devastating and unexpected flood event, and the anchors wore somber faces as they talked about displaced families and millions of dollars in damages. They didn't say my name, not yet, but I knew it was coming. By afternoon, the sheriff came back, this time with 2 deputies and a man in a county jacket who introduced himself as an engineer. They asked if I'd be willing to walk them up to the dam, and I agreed. We drove up together in silence, the road slick with mud from the runoff. When we got to the clearing, the engineer inspected the dam, crouching down to examine the open sluice gate. He muttered under his breath about capacity and design limitations, scribbling notes on a clipboard. Then he stood and asked me if I understood what I had done. I let the river do what it's meant to do, I said. If those houses weren't there, you wouldn't even be here asking questions. The sheriff didn't respond, but I could see the weight in his eyes. This wasn't just about property damage anymore. This was about politics, about liability, about who was going to take the fall. They told me not to touch the dam again, that they might need to close it to prevent further flooding, and I told them I wouldn't stop them if they needed to. But as I watched them work, I could see that the damage was already done. The water level was finally receding, but the valley had been changed permanently. The topsoil was gone in some places, exposing rock. Several of the roads had been washed out completely, leaving deep gullies that would take months to fill. When I drove back home later, I saw the first angry crowd gathered near the subdivision entrance. They were residents, most of them still in muddy boots, their clothes soaked, faces red with rage. A few of them recognized me and started shouting before I even rolled down my window. One man banged on the side of my truck, yelling that I had ruined his life, that everything he owned was gone. Another woman stood in the middle of the road with tears streaming down her face, screaming that I belonged in prison. I didn't answer them. I just drove slowly through, keeping my eyes ahead. That night, the HOA held what they called an emergency meeting, though it was less of a meeting and more of a shouting match under a makeshift tent. I didn't go, but I could hear from my porch the angry voices carrying through the still night air. The next day, I received a notice taped to my fence post. It was from the HOA's lawyer, demanding compensation for damages and accusing me of willful destruction of property. I laughed out loud when I read it. Compensation. They had taken my valley, built their dreams on my soil, and now they wanted me to pay for their mistake. The lawsuits started pouring in after that, some from individual homeowners, some from the HOA itself, and even one from the development company that had built the houses. They accused me of negligence, of malicious intent, of sabotage. My lawyer, the same one who had tried to fight for my land before, came to see me and said this was going to get ugly. He told me I could try to settle, but I refused. I wasn't going to pay them a dime. If it meant go to court, then we would go to court. The media finally caught wind of my name. Within a week, I was being called a damn man on every channel. Half the anchors portray me as some unhinged recluse with a grudge against progress. They showed old pictures of my cabin, of me standing in front of it with my arms crossed, as though I was some villain in a Western movie. But something unexpected happened too. People started showing up at my gate, not with torches and pitchforks, but with handshakes and quiet words of support. Farmers from neighboring counties came by to say they understood that they'd had land taken by developers too. Even a few of the folks from town who had always kept their distance stopped in to say I'd done what they wished they could do. The HOA didn't like that one bit. They sent private security to patrol the entrance to their subdivision, claiming they were afraid of retaliation. They filed complaints with the county about ongoing harassment, even though I hadn't set foot on their side of the river since the flood. The more they pushed, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about water damage anymore. This was about control. They wanted me broken, humiliated, stripped of any power I still had over this land. But I wasn't going anywhere. As the weeks went on, I started repairing the dam, not to hold the water back completely, but to keep it steady enough to prevent another disaster. I kept everything legal, documented every step, and even sent reports to the county, so they couldn't accuse me of anything underhanded. But I also made sure they knew that as long as I owned this land, I controlled the river. That was my leverage, and I wasn't about to give it up. Some nights, I sat on the porch and watched the lights down the valley, the glow of generators and work crews trying to rebuild. I wondered what they were saying about me. If they told their kids I was some kind of monster hiding in the hills. Maybe I was in their eyes, but I didn't feel like a monster. I felt like a man who had been pushed too far and had finally pushed back. And deep down, I knew the fight wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase. The court summons came on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered by a deputy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. He didn't meet my eyes as he passed me the envelope, just muttered a polite, "Have a good day," before heading back to his cruiser. Inside were the documents I'd been expecting. The HOA's lawsuit, naming me as a sole defendant and accusing me of intentional flooding, malicious destruction of property, and unlawful tamper with public infrastructure. That last part made me laugh. The dam wasn't public infrastructure. It was mine. I had built it, maintained it, paid for every bolt and beam with my own money. But in their eyes, everything I did was illegal now. I drove into town that afternoon to meet with my lawyer. His office smelled like coffee and old paper, and he was already waiting with the documents spread out across his desk. He had that look he always got when he had bad news to deliver, calm, professional, but with a shadow of worry in his eyes. He told me the HOA had hired a major law firm from the city, the kind that didn't bother with small claims. They were looking to bankrupt me in court, to drag this out until I either gave up or lost everything. I asked him if we had a case, if we could win, and he nodded slowly. "We can fight this," he said, "but it won't be cheap and it won't be quick. They're counting on wearing you down." I told him to fight anyway. The first hearing was scheduled 2 weeks later, and by then the media circus had grown louder. News vans parked outside the courthouse. Reporters shoved microphones at me as I walked up the steps, asking if I felt any remorse, if I understood the suffering I had caused. I told them the only thing I regretted was not being listened to before it came to this. Inside the courtroom, the HOA's lawyers tried to paint me as a dangerous loner, a man with a grudge against society. They showed pictures of flooded homes, the ruined possessions, the children standing in knee-deep water, holding stuffed animals. The jury sat stone-faced, taking it all in. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up and told them the truth. I told them about the day the developer first showed up at my gate, about the survey maps that didn't match, about the months I spent trying to stop the project before a single foundation was poured. I told them how I called every county office, every official I could, and how no one cared. They built those homes knowing the risk, I said. They built them on stolen land, in a floodplain, and they paved over the natural drainage that kept this valley safe. All I did was stop holding the river back. Some of the jurors looked away. Others nodded slightly, as if they understood. The judge listened quietly, tapping a pen against the bench. And when I sat down, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I wasn't sure if I had convinced anyone, but at least I had said my piece. The case dragged on for weeks, each side bringing in experts to argue about water flow rates, flood maps, and property lines. Surveyors testified. Engineers testified. Even a few county officials who looked uncomfortable under oath admitted that there had been administrative errors in how the land had been rezoned. The HOA board sat in a tight little row behind their lawyers, whispering and glaring at me whenever I turned around. They looked less like victims now and more like what they really were, opportunists who had gambled and lost. Outside the courtroom, things were just as tense. Protesters started showing up on both sides, some holding signs calling me a domestic terrorist, others calling me a hero of the land. The sheriff had to post deputies near the courthouse steps to keep fights from breaking out. News commentators debated my case every night on TV, some calling me reckless, others saying I was a symbol of rural America fighting back against corporate overreach. I didn't ask to be anyone's symbol, but there it was. Back home, life became a strange mix of routine and siege. Every day I checked the dam, made sure it was stable, took notes and photos to document its condition. I built new fences around the property, not just to keep out trespassers, but to remind myself where the boundaries still stood, where my authority began and ended. Sometimes I caught HOA members driving by slow, taking pictures, as if they were looking for evidence they could use against me. Once, someone threw a rock through my mailbox, shattering it. Another time, I found tire tracks cutting across one of my fields, deep ruts that would take hours to smooth out. They were trying to intimidate me, but all it did was make me dig my heels in deeper. Then came the settlement offer. The HOA's lawyer sent it through my attorney. If I paid a portion of the damages and agreed to sign over the rights to the floodplain, they would drop the lawsuit and move forward amicably. I didn't even let my lawyer finish reading it before I said no. Giving up the floodplain would mean giving up the last thing I had, the last thing protecting me from them building even more homes. I wasn't going to hand them the keys to the kingdom. The next phase of the trial got uglier. Their lawyers tried to get me charged criminally for reckless endangerment, arguing that I had put lives at risk by opening the dam. The prosecutor, probably under pressure from the county commissioners, decided to take the case. I found myself standing in a criminal courtroom, the state now accusing me of being a danger to the public. My lawyer argued that I had acted within my rights, that the dam was private, that there was no statute requiring me to hold back water on behalf of people who had built illegally. The case was technical, full of legal jargon and old water rights precedents, but when the judge finally ruled, he dismissed the criminal charges. The HOA board was furious. They held a press conference outside the courthouse, calling the decision a miscarriage of justice, vowing to take the fight to a higher court if necessary. I watched the footage on TV that night and saw the fear behind their anger. They had expected me to break, to bend under the pressure. Instead, I had stood my ground, and now they didn't know what to do with me. It was around that time that I started getting letters from people I had never met, ranchers, landowners, even a few lawyers from other states, telling me to keep fighting, offering advice, even money for my legal fund. Some of them wrote about their own battles with HOAs and developers, how they had been forced off their land or bullied into selling. I realized that what had started as a personal fight was now something bigger. I wasn't just defending my valley anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had ever been steamrolled by bureaucracy and greed. One night, as I sat on the porch watching the moonlight shimmer on the still swollen river, I thought about what might come next. The lawsuits weren't over. The anger wasn't over, and the threat of losing everything still hung over me. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. The dam stood where it always had. The river flowed where it was meant to flow, and the valley, my valley, was still mine. The winter that followed was the harshest we'd seen in years, as if the valley itself had decided to help keep outsiders away. Snow came early and stayed late, blanketing the hills in white, turning the dirt roads into treacherous paths of ice. I spent most of my days chopping wood, checking the dam, and shoring up the cabin against the cold. Even though the lawsuits were still grinding their way through the courts, the world outside seemed to quiet down for a while, as though everyone was waiting for spring to see what would happen next. But the HOA didn't wait. They sent surveyors to my property line again, this time with deputies to ensure their safety. I stood there in the snow, shotgun slung over my shoulder, and watched them hammer stakes into the ground. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't need to, but they knew I was there, watching. A few weeks later, a notice arrived in the mail saying they were petitioning the county to force the sale of a portion of flood-affected land for public safety reasons. That was their next move. If they couldn't beat me in court fast enough, they would try to take it through eminent domain, claiming that my property was a hazard to the public. I drove straight to my lawyer's office, threw the notice on his desk, and asked him what we could do. He sighed and said this was a new angle, one that would be harder to fight, because it wasn't just the HOA this time. It was the county itself. He warned me that if the commissioners voted in favor of the petition, I might be forced to sell whether I wanted to or not. The thought of losing even a piece of my valley made my blood boil. Then we fight harder, I said, whatever it takes. When spring finally came, so did the tension. The snowmelt made the river run high again, and the county sent crews to inspect the dam more frequently. They didn't have the authority to take control of it. Not yet, but I could tell they were looking for an excuse. Any excuse. They wanted to say it was unsafe, that it had to be removed, that it was a danger to homes that never should have been there in the first place. I documented everything. Photos, video, water levels, even my maintenance logs going back years. If they were going to accuse me of neglect, I would drown them in evidence. Meanwhile, the media coverage had shifted. At first, they had painted me as a dangerous recluse. Now, after months of coverage and legal testimony, they were starting to portray me differently. The bigger outlets were running pieces about rural property rights, eminent domain abuse, and how unchecked development was putting entire communities at risk. They showed footage of the valley before the flood and after, comparing the natural floodplain to the subdivision's reckless construction. It was the first time I felt like someone was finally telling the real story. But the HOA was far from done. One night, just after midnight, I heard an engine on the road, a truck stopping near the dam. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight and made my way up the trail. When I got close enough, I saw two men working near the sluice gate, one of them holding a crowbar. They were trying to jam the mechanism shut, probably to keep me from ever opening it again. I stepped out of the shadows, racked the rifle, and shined a light on them. They froze like deer. I didn't have to fire a shot. Just the sound of me chambering around was enough to send them scrambling back into their truck and tearing down the road. I stood there under the moonlight, heart pounding, until the sound of the engine faded. That night, I slept with a rifle next to the door. The next morning, I found fresh tire tracks near the dam and footprints in the mud. I took pictures of everything and called the sheriff. He came out, took a report, but I could tell he didn't expect much to come of it. "You've made some powerful enemies," he said before leaving. The attempted sabotage lit a fire under me. If they want to take my land, they were going to have to do it the hard way, out in the open, with the whole county watching. I started attending county meetings, standing up in front of commissioners and making my case. I brought maps, historical records, even photos of the valley from 50 years ago showing the natural flood patterns. I reminded them that if it hadn't been for the dam, the flood would have been worse, not better. Some of them listened. Some didn't. But at least they had to hear me. The legal battle stretched into summer, and by then I was no longer just one man fighting an HOA. Landowners from 3 neighboring counties started showing up to support me at hearings. Local newspapers ran editorials calling my case the battle for the valley, and even state politicians began weighing in. The HOA board started to fracture under the pressure. Some members resigning, others turning on each other in public meetings. They had overplayed their hand, and now the entire community was paying the price for their greed. But I knew it wasn't over until the final gavel fell. The county commissioner scheduled a vote on the eminent domain petition, and the night of the vote, the courthouse was packed. Farmers, lawyers, activists, reporters, everyone came to see what would happen. I stood at the podium when it was my turn to speak, my voice steady as I told them what this land meant, not just to me but to the valley itself. If you take this from me, I said, you're not just taking my land. You're taking away the last barrier between this river and the chaos that will come the next time it floods. You're taking away the right of every person in this county to decide how we live on this land. When the vote came, it was close, 3-2, but they voted against taking my property. I walked out of that courthouse with the weight of a mountain lifted off my shoulders. Outside, people cheered, slapped me on the back, told me I'd won. And maybe I had for now, but as I drove back to cabin that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that this war wasn't finished. The HOA still existed. The houses still stood, and the river was still there, waiting. That night, as the stars burned bright over the valley, I sat on the porch with a bottle of whiskey and stared out at the dark ribbon of water cutting through the land. I thought about everything that had happened, the lawsuits, the threats, the attempted sabotage, and I knew I wasn't done fighting. I didn't want to destroy anyone's life, but I also wasn't going to let them destroy mine. If they pushed me again, if they tried to take the valley once more, I knew exactly what I would do. The dam would always be there. The river would always be there. And so would I. The last push came in late summer, on a blistering hot day when the river had dropped low and the valley looked almost peaceful again. I was sitting on the porch sharpening a chisel when I heard the rumble of heavy equipment down the road. Not just trucks this time, but bulldozers, backhoes, and graders. I grabbed my hat, slid the chisel into my belt, and climbed into the truck. When I rounded the bend near the subdivision, I saw them. A whole convoy of machines parked along the edge of the floodplain, men in reflective vests standing around in clusters, clipboards in hand. There were county trucks there too, which meant this wasn't just an HOA stunt. This was official. I parked on the shoulder and walked down toward them. The foreman stepped forward, holding out a paper, saying they had authorization to begin work to mitigate future flooding risks. That was government talk for cutting into my land, reshaping the riverbanks, and making sure I never had the ability to flood them again. They weren't taking the land, not legally, but they were going to tear it apart until it was useless to me. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the machines, the men, the paper with its county seal. Then I told them to pack up and leave. The foreman shifted uncomfortably, said he had orders. You don't want to be here when this starts, he warned. We'll call the sheriff if we have to. Go ahead, I said, and then I turned and walked away. I didn't go home. I drove straight up to the dam. The air was heavy, the kind of air that comes before a storm. I could feel my heart thundering in my chest as I parked the truck and climbed the embankment. The wheel was right where it always was, rust-streaked but solid under my hands. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers tight on the spokes, sweat running down my back. This wasn't like last time. This wasn't just about proving a point. This was about the line in the sand. Either they respected it or I erased it. When the gate opened, the sound was deafening. A deep, thunderous roar that shook the air around me. The reservoir water surged forward like a beast uncaged, slamming into the river below and sending spray into the sky. I stood there until the wheel couldn't turn any farther. Then I got in the truck and drove down fast, following the water's path as it rushed toward the floodplain. By the time I reached the subdivision, the first trickles were already spilling over the road. The crews were still there, scrambling now, shouting orders, trying to move the bulldozers out of the way. I stopped my truck on a rise again, the same rise where I stood months ago, and watched as the water came roaring down. It filled the ditches, swelled over the banks, and then spread into the very ground they had been preparing to cut open. The machines were swallowed one by one, their wheels spinning helplessly in the mud until the operators abandoned them and fled to higher ground. People came out of their homes again, yelling, waving their arms, some of them even pointing at me. But I didn't move. I stood there with my arms crossed, the sun beating down, until the water reached the foundations of the homes closest to the river. It wasn't as bad as the first time. I hadn't drained the entire reservoir, but it was enough to stop their work, enough to remind them that this valley didn't belong to them. The sheriff arrived not long after. Sirens wailing, his cruiser throwing up spray as it skidded to a stop. He climbed out, face red, and shouted at me to close the gate. I told him I would, once the message had been delivered. He swore under his breath, then looked at the water rising below, the crew standing around helplessly, and finally back at me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then he sighed and told me I was under arrest. They took me in, cuffed me, and drove me to town. Reporters were waiting at the station, cameras flashing as I was led inside. They charged me this time, trespassing, vandalism, reckless endangerment, and set a bail I could barely afford. Friends from the neighboring counties pooled together to cover it, and by the next day I was back home. The arrest didn't scare me. If anything, it lit the fire even hotter. When the case hit court, the courtroom was so full people had to stand in the back. The HOA's lawyers demanded jail time, demanded fines so high they'd take my cabin too. My lawyer argued that I had acted in self-defense, not against the person, but against the slow-motion theft of my land. He showed every map, every survey, every photo, proving that what they had been about to do would have permanently destroyed the natural flow of the valley. He reminded the judge that the first flood had already been ruled not a crime, that I had every right to operate the dam as I saw fit. The trial went on for days, but when the verdict finally came, the judge dismissed most of the charges. He fined me a small sum for the recklessness of opening the gate without notifying authorities, but it was a slap on the wrist compared to what the HOA had wanted. The courtroom erupted, half the crowd cheering, half of them shouting in anger, and the judge had to bang his gavel to restore order. Outside, reporters swarmed me again, asking if I had any plans to open the dam in the future. I told them the same thing I told the court. I didn't want to flood anyone, but I wasn't going to let anyone take my land. If the HOA left me alone, I'd leave them alone. If they came back, well, the river would still be waiting. Months passed after that, and slowly, life in the valley returned to something like normal. The county backed off their plans to reshape the floodplain. The HOA stopped sending me letters. A few of the homeowners even put their houses up for sale, tired of the fight, tired of living in a place where the river was a constant threat. Little by little, the subdivision started to empty out. Grass grew tall in some of the yards. Paint started to peel, and the valley began to look like itself again. I still check the dam every morning, still keep the wheel oiled and ready, but I haven't had to open it again. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sit on the porch with drink and watch the sunset burn across the hills. The valley is mine, still scarred but alive, and I know now that no piece of paper, no board of neighbors with rules and fines, will ever take that from me. The fight left its mark on me. It hardened me, but also made me realize what I'm willing to stand for and what I'll never surrender. People still drive by sometimes to look at the place, like it's some kind of landmark, the spot where one man stood up to an entire community and didn't back down. They whisper, they point, but they don't come up the driveway. And that's just how I like it. Because out here, in the valley I bled for, there's only one law that matters, the law of the river. And as long as I draw breath, I'll make sure it runs the way it's meant to run.